Hello, welcome everybody to Catch Up Wales. This is the third of 4 sessions on GCSE biology, and I will now hand you over to Mrs. Sidat, who will be presenting the session this evening. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is my session today on evolution by natural selection. My name is Mrs. Sidat, and we're going to get straight into it. Okay, so today we are going to be looking at the process of natural selection. We're going to link to evolution, and then we're going to look at all the key features that you need to know in order to fully understand the process of natural selection. So what are we going to look at? Number one, we're going to link back to what variation is, what the causes of variation are, and we're going to link that to mutations. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at competition. We're then going to look at how some organisms might have a survival advantage over others. And finally, we're going to look at how those who have a survival advantage then can reproduce and pass on genes. And we're going to look at this through examples that have already been on the WJC in previous years. Okay. All right, let's start with what causes variation. So you can see there in the top right-hand corner, we've got just some children sat together. And if we were to look at those children, we could probably identify several different variations between them. Skin color, hair color, height, weight, eye color, whether someone can roll their tongue, whether someone has dimples, whether someone has freckles. Okay, so there are lots of physical variation that we can see within a species. Some of that variation is due to genetic causes, so we call it genetic variation. This is caused by differences in your genes that you inherit from your parents. Okay, for example, eye color, tongue rolling, so the ability to roll your tongue or not, and height are 3 examples of variation that can be caused by your genes. Now, in the previous session, in session 1, we looked at eye color, fur color, and we know sometimes some of those characteristics are caused by one single gene, which we call monohybrid inheritance, and sometimes they're caused by a combination of genes. But it's not just our genes that can cause variation in a species. All you've got to think about is identical twins. Identical twins share the exact same DNA. They came from one single sperm and egg, which then split into 2 cells. But if you know any identical twins, you probably can tell them apart. And the reason why you can tell them apart is because they have what we call environmental variation. And these are differences between the species that occur because of their lifestyle. So something that happens in their life. So for example, scars and bruises would be an example of environmental variation. Skin tone, okay, yes, we can see natural skin tone in the picture above, but if you go on holiday, not like me, unfortunately, but if you go on holiday and you have a lovely tan, then that's going to affect your skin tone. But also height. Now, you might notice that height is in both of those categories, because there are some characteristics that can actually be caused by both genetic causes and environmental causes. And height, oh, I don't know why that's gone down there, height is an example of that. So some features result from a combination of heritable genetic variation and environmental variation. So some people could be naturally tall, but if they didn't have the correct diet whilst they're growing up, then they're not going to reach their full potential in height. Okay, so there are 2 causes of variation, genetic variation and environmental variation. Now, how do we measure variation? Well, some types of variation, like the ability to roll your tongue, can be answered with either just a yes or a no. Whereas something like eye color might have particular categories, so brown or blue, gray, green or hazel or gray. So we have different colors of eyes, but we don't have a wide variety of colors. So we call this discontinuous variation, okay? Meaning that the answers to this type of variation are often a particular category or a discrete category. How tall are you? will give us a range of results. Okay, so different people are different heights. And if we were to measure, let's say in your school, the height of everyone all the way from year 7 all the way up to, let's say, year 13, then we would have a wide variety of heights. We call this continuous variation because that's what it's doing. It's continuous, which gives us a whole range of answers. So how would we draw a graph for these? Well, because discontinuous has discrete categories, it lends itself to a bar graph, whereas continuous variation is often plotted on a line. Okay, so as we can see here, we've got at the bottom our bar graph on the left-hand side, and because we would have particular categories and you would fall into one of those distinct categories, we would then use a bar chart or bar graph. On the right-hand side then, we can see that height is continuous data. So we need a line graph there because we're going to have a lot of different heights available. Yes, we're going to have different people at those different heights. Okay, so if you took the heights of all the people in your school, I'm sure there would be more than one person that had a height of 157 centimeters. Okay, and that would give you a line graph. So what causes genetic variation? So we know that new genes, we looked at genetic code briefly in the first session. We know that new genes result from something called a mutation. Now, a mutation is a change to the genetic code in your DNA. Mutations occur at random, okay? When the DNA is unraveling, if you go on to A-level or you're planning on going on to A-level, DNA will unravel and it will replicate. And when it replicates, those base pairs sometimes make mistakes. So mutations occur at random. Most mutations that happen on our DNA have absolutely no effect on us whatsoever. However, some can be beneficial or harmful, and some can lead to a new phenotype. And as you can see here in the bottom right-hand corner, I've put one of the most famous examples of natural selection. You might have studied this in school already. This is the peppered moth. And we can see here, this was the original peppered moth, but there was a dark version of the peppered moth as well. And this change in the gene came about because of a mutation. And if we look here, this is the DNA up in the top right-hand corner. So this is our DNA, our double helix with our base pairs. A mutation would be that one of these base pairs would change. Okay, so sometimes the change in the base pair can have an effect on the gene, on the protein that's being coded for by that gene. And as a result, you might get a new phenotype. Remember, phenotype from the first session was a physical characteristic, something visible. And in this case, we can see that the peppered moth is a different color. Okay, we had a light peppered moth and then a dark peppered moth. And this was due to a mutation. Okay, so we're going to quickly go through what you've been through so far. So I want you to think about what is the missing word in this example. So differences between individuals of a species is known as what? Have a little think of that answer now. Say it out loud or write it down on a piece of paper. Differences between individuals of a species is known as, if you wrote variation, down. Variation can be caused by genes, the something, or a combination of both. What's the missing word there? Variation can be caused by genes, the something, or a combination of both. Environment, Diane. Fur colour in mice is an example of what type of variation? Fur colour in mice is an example of what type of variation? If you said genetic, you were right, Diane. A something is a change to a gene? What do we call it when a gene changes? A mutation. Okay, so a mutation is a change to a gene. Mutations are the cause of what type of variation? Okay, so we know that it's in genetic or environmental. So what type of variation would mutations be the cause of? Genetic. If you said genetic, Diane. And the last one then, very occasionally, a mutation will lead to a new what? What was that keyword that we just used? Remember, we talking about a visible characteristic, like the peppered moth, light and dark. What do we call it? A phenotype. Okay, Diane. All right, if you didn't have a chance to go through those after the session, then you can have another go yourself. Okay. Okay, so who came up with the theory of natural selection? Now, these two scientists both worked on the evidence for natural selection. On the on the right-hand side, we've got Charles Darwin, and on the left-hand side, we've got Alfred Wallace. Both of these scientists worked on the theory of natural selection, evolution by natural selection. And in an exam, if you're asked who proposed the theory of evolution through natural selection, you are allowed to say Darwin, who probably is one of the more famous out of the two of them, or Wallace. Okay, and they're looking for their surnames. It'd be lovely if you gave their first name as well. Okay, but they'll accept their surnames. Okay, so Darwin and Wallace are the scientists that were involved in the theory of natural selection. And this was back in 1858. And since then, the theory of natural selection has been adapted and refined, but now is accepted as the mechanism of evolution. Okay, and it's accepted by the vast majority of scientists. So what do we understand by evolution? What is it? What is evolution? Well, evolution is the gradual change of inherited characteristics within a population, and this would happen over a period of time. Evolution is never just going to happen in one day. Evolution is something that happens over a long period of time, and it happens due to the change of inherited characteristics within a population, within a species. Evolution results in organisms becoming better adapted. Now that's a key term, better adapted, or you might have heard in school, better suited to their environment. Today I'm going to use the term better adapted, okay, because we usually talk about an environmental change, okay? A lot of the examples that we're going to look at are talking about an environmental change. So this results in organisms becoming better adapted or suited to their environment. This can only happen because every population shows variation. So when we talk about natural selection, we always start with the idea that within a population there is variation, there is differences between the species. And this occurs through natural selection. So what I'm going to do today is, rather than just give you a definition of what natural selection is, I'm going to do it through the use of examples. Because if you see it work through an example, you're more likely to be able to apply that then to an example, let's say if you had an assessment on it. Okay. So let's do another little quick quiz. Check the time. Okay. Okay, so according to the theory of evolution, new species evolve by what? A, artificial selection, which you might have heard of. B, natural selection. Or C, unnatural selection. Which of those is the correct answer? A, B, or C? If you said B, you are correct. Diane. Individuals in a species show a wide range of variation because of differences in their what? Their genes, their hormones, which we do look at in this biology, or cells. What does it show a wide variation of? What is the differences in? Their genes. Okay, so if you said A, genes, you are correct. The last one then, the individuals most likely to survive to reproduce are those: A, with no immunity to disease. B, poorly suited to their environment, or C, well suited to their environment? Which ones are most likely to survive? If you said C, you were right, Diane. They've got to be well suited to their environment. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the process of natural selection using these keywords. So I like to think of natural selection as a series of questions. And when you come to a natural selection question in your exams, then you're going to be thinking about these keywords: variation, mutation, competition, survival advantage, being able to survive, breeding, and then passing on genes. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in case rather than you remembering all of those words off by heart, I'm going to think about different questions we can ask ourselves if we get one of these questions. So the first one is that we're going to look at the peppered moth. Okay, so here's the peppered moth. The peppered moth is a very famous example of natural selection whereby the dark peppered moth had the survival advantage and the light peppered moth didn't and died out. And it was all because of the effects of the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, these trees that they lived on were very light in their bark colour. So the light peppered moth were able to camouflage nicely against them. But after the Industrial Revolution, the bark of the tree started to darken because of the pollution that was released from the Industrial Revolution. And as a result, the dark peppered moth was now able to camouflage better than the light peppered moth. Okay, so let's have a look at this example then. What variation is there and what caused this? So we always start our natural selection questions with the idea of identifying the variation in this example. So the variation in this example is that there is some moths that have a light colour and some moths that have a dark colour. That's the genetic variation. Okay, why is there a genetic variation? Well, because of a mutation. Okay, so the first question we're always going to ask ourselves is, what variation is there? So you're going to identify the variation and then you're going to say what caused this variation to happen. And it's always going to be a mutation. So you don't have to think. If you're talking about variation, you say this was because of a mutation. Second question then, what are they competing for? Now, difficult one this, all organisms compete for something, okay? Competition is one of the topics that you've got to learn for the very first biology topic. And in this example then, I think the thing that we've got to think about, yes, they're going to be competing for resources, but the main thing is that they don't want to be killed by predators. So they've got to be able to camouflage. Number 3, who has the survival advantage and why? So because the bark of the tree, has darkened, that means that the darker coloured moth has the survival advantage. Why? Because they can camouflage better with their environment. Okay, the darker moth has the survival advantage because they can camouflage better. Then we get on to this idea of survival of the fittest. I'm sure that you've heard of that term before. Okay, survival of the fittest is all talking about then what will happen to those dark moths that have the survival advantage. They are therefore more likely to survive and breed. And then we can talk about what happens then. The darker coloured moths will be more likely to pass on the genes for the darker colour to the next generation. And this will happen over a series of generations. So you can see here, we've hit all our keywords. We've talked about variation. We've talked about a mutation. We've talked about what they're competing for. We've talked about who had the survival advantage. We've said that they are more likely to survive and breed, and then they can pass on the genes to the next generation. And we can use this structure for literally any example for natural selection. I'm going to show you another one. Here's our giraffes. Okay, so in the evolution of giraffes, they didn't always have super long necks. Okay, some had short necks, some had long necks, like the example that you can see there on the left-hand side. So our keywords are exactly the same, but it's just a different example. Okay, so we're asking ourselves, how did giraffes evolve to have a long neck? Well, we ask the same questions. What variation is there? And what caused this? So there is genetic variation due to a mutation in their genes. Okay, that meant that some giraffes developed a longer neck, whereas some giraffes had a shorter neck. What are they competing for? Well, in this example, they need food. Okay, the giraffes are competing for food, which is found high up in the trees. Who has the survival advantage and why? Well, the giraffe with the longer neck is going to be able to reach further for his food. So therefore, the longer neck giraffes have the survival advantage because they can get more food. They have a wider range of reach to get the food that they want. Then we talk about survival of the fittest. So the longer necked giraffes are more likely to survive and breed, which means passing on genes. The longer necked giraffes are, should be more likely to pass on their genes for the longer necks to the next generation. Okay, and you can see that we're structuring it in exactly the same way. Okay, let's look at some past paper questions then, do a time check. So I'm going to do a couple of foundation tier questions and then I'm going to move on to some higher tier questions. Okay, these higher tier questions might have come from old exams whereby there would have been a crossover question. So even though it might say higher tier, this could be a question that could have appeared on both the foundation and the higher tier. Okay, so just be aware of that. So this is my first foundation tier question and it's about rats. Some rats evolved a resistance to the rat poison warfarin. The information below shows some stages in the development of the resistance, but not in the correct order. Okay, so we've got number 1. So the useful mutation is passed on to offspring. Stage 2, a mutation occurred in a gene. Stage 3, the mutation is useful. Stage 4, rats with the mutation survive and reproduce. And then stage 5, as a result, there is an increase in the population of rats with the mutation. So again, it's a natural selection question, but this time, rather than you having to write it, they've given it to you in the exam question. So this question was asking you to complete the sequence below to show the stages in the correct order. And one has been done for you. So the first one is that a mutation occurred in a gene. Okay, that was the very first thing that they wanted you to write down. But what is the rest of the order? I'll give you just a minute to have a little think. What order would you place these in? So stage 2, a mutation occurred in a gene. What's next? Step 3 was next. You're correct. The mutation is useful. So in this example, these rats are becoming resistant to warfarin, meaning that they are not going to be poisoned by this warfarin drug. So once the mutation is useful, then what's going to happen? Rats with the mutation survive and reproduce. So if you said 4 next, you were right. Then what's next? Number 1, because they survive and reproduce, they pass on the useful mutation to the next generation. And then as a result, there is an increase in the population of rats within the with the mutation, sorry. Okay, so it should be 2, 3, 4, 1, 5. Part B of that question focused on what would happen to a species that could not adapt to the new environmental conditions. So if we talk about this idea that an environment changes, if an organism can't evolve quick enough, then what will happen to it? Well, it will become extinct. And this is what's happened to lots of different organisms over time. Okay, they haven't adapted quick enough to their natural, to the change in the environment. So therefore they've become extinct. Okay, and in brackets there I've put died out or wiped out because they also put that in the mark scheme. I think become extinct is a much better answer for that question. Okay, what about this one then? Again, this was a foundation tier paper. Species that fail to evolve may become extinct. What is the meaning of the term extinct? What does it mean if an organism becomes extinct, like the dodo? Well, it means that they've died out, or they've gone forever, they no longer exist, or they've been wiped out. Okay, all of those answers there were allowed on the mark scheme in 2015. And the last one then, species evolved by natural selection. Give the names of the scientists who first described evolution by natural selection. What were their names? So you're allowed to say Charles Darwin or Alfred Wallace. And I've put these in brackets here because they do allow you just to write their surnames. Okay, lovely obviously if you put their first names, and you can have either of these scientists. Don't just write Charles and Alfie. Okay, so no Charles and Alfie, you must write their surnames. Okay, what we're going to do now then is we're going to have a look at some specific questions. And I just want you to have a little bit of time to try and look through these examples. Now I'm going to try my best to use my highlighter. Okay, so we can identify what's going on. So in this example then, you can see that we've got a question about cockroaches. Okay, and they tell you in the first bit of the sentence then that cockroaches are pests which spoil food and spread disease. They have a gene which makes them attracted to sugar. Okay, so that's going to be important. Okay, because that might give us some indication about what's going on. In the 1980s, pest controllers used a mixture of insecticide. Now, you have to know what insecticide is. Okay, it says down here, look, insecticides kills them. Okay, so insecticides, they used a mixture of insecticide and sugar as a means of pest control. The sugar attracted the cockroaches and the insecticide killed them. Right, so you get an idea about how they were doing it. So in 1980, pests were putting down insecticide, which was covered in sugar. The cockroaches went towards the sugar because they were attracted to it, but then they were killed by the insecticide. Now, in the 1990s, certain populations of cockroaches had changed. Now, here's the important bit now. They changed, but how did they change? So that they were no longer attracted to sugar. Okay, so already we can identify the variation in this example. They've changed, they were attracted to sugar, but now they're no longer attracted to sugar. So it says the insecticide was still lethal, but the cockroaches avoided eating it when it was mixed with sugar. Explain how. Okay, explain how. There's your command. The cockroaches evolved. So we're talking about natural selection here to survive the pest control. Okay, so we're looking at how they survived. So we have to think about natural selection. If they talk about evolution, evolution is through natural selection. So this is a natural selection question. And here are my 4 questions I want you to think about. Every question we're going to do today is going to be based on these 4 questions. Okay, for your answer. So what variation is there and what caused this? What competition is there? Who has the survival advantage and why? And what are survivors able to do? So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to have a little think about it. And then we're going to go through it. Okay, so the first thing that we want to think about then is what is the variation? What is the change in this example? What is the difference between the cockroaches? Well, some cockroaches were attracted to sugar and others weren't. Okay, that's the variation. Okay, so the variation in this example is that some cockroaches were attracted to sugar and others weren't. But what caused this variation? Well, a mutation in a gene caused the variation in cockroaches. Okay, so the mutation in a gene caused variation in cockroaches. Some cockroaches were attracted to sugar and others weren't. Okay, that's always going to be your first point, identifying the variation and explaining why there is variation in that species. Okay, in this example then, what is the competition? Well, in this example, they want sugar, they want food, so there is competition for food. But who has the survival advantage? We've got two variations now, one that is attracted to sugar, one that's not attracted to sugar. Who has the survival advantage out of those two? Well, the cockroaches that were not attracted to the sugar had the survival advantage. So you must identify who has the survival advantage and then explain why they have this survival advantage. So they have this advantage because they avoided eating the insecticide which was mixed with the sugar. Okay, so those organisms did not eat the sugar and obviously then did not consume the insecticide. So what could those survivors do? Well, the cockroaches that weren't attracted to the sugar, so avoided the sugar, were able to breed and pass on their gene to the next generation. And this then was repeated over many, many generations. And that's why we can't use sugar mixed with insecticide as a way of killing cockroaches. Okay, so there's one example of natural selection. Let's see if we can do another. This one is about deer mice. Now, it doesn't matter that you don't know anything about deer mice, okay, because they tell you everything that you need to know in the question. So then we read it again, read for purpose. So deer mice live in the sandhills of Nebraska. Don't really need to know that. The genetic analysis, so we got some keywords here. So genetic analysis, what does that mean? Well, what we're talking about then is we're comparing the DNA of the ancient remains, okay? Oh dear, the ancient remains. So we're looking at the deer mice, the ancient remains of the deer mice, and we're looking at their DNA, okay? And we can analyze them. So these were deer mice that lived around 10,000 years ago. And the only genes that they could find in their genetic analysis was the coat colour for dark coloured fur. So back 10,000 years ago, there wasn't variation in coat colour for the deer mice. But 10,000 years ago, when the sandhills formed, where they live now, the deer mice living today have sand-coloured fur. Okay, so today we have sand-coloured fur. Back 10,000 years ago, we had dark-coloured fur. Okay, so now we've identified our variation. So we could even highlight our question and put a little V there for variation. And we know then that that variation is caused by a mutation. So they have sand-coloured fur, which was controlled by a gene called GUTI. So they've named the gene in this example. This gene has not been found in the ancient remains of deer mice. So we've done some genetic analysis. We've compared the DNA of the ancient remains of deer mice 10,000 years ago, and we've compared the deer mice of today. And we've noticed that 10,000 years ago, there were dark-coloured fur. Today, they have sand-coloured fur. Write an explanation, here it is again, of the evolution of coat colour. Okay, so we're talking about how did they go from dark to sand colour. Now this question, the reason why I've put this one in is because it says in your explanation, refer to the process of natural selection, which we're going to do with our 4 questions. But it also says, and the importance of genetic analysis. So they want you to talk about how we got this information in the first place. So we're going to use our 4 questions, okay, to help us with our answer. And you can see here, because this has got an and they want you to do something else, I put a little extra box there for extras. Okay, did they mention anything else that you need to think about? Oh, this one's not showing very well. Okay, so let's talk through. Okay, the picture's gone over it, I'm afraid. So in this example then, there was a mutation in the gene that coded for coat colour. And it caused there to be variation within the colour of their coat. So some had dark coloured fur, some had sand coloured fur. What competition is there? Well, there's always going to be competition for resources, but in this example, remember, we're talking about sand coloured furred mice living in sandy habitats. So we're talking about trying not to get killed by predators, the idea about camouflage. Who has the survival advantage and why? Well, around this time, remember, we had sand hills develop in Nebraska. So the sand-coloured fur mice had the survival advantage because they can camouflage against the sand from predators. So what can survivors do? The sand-coloured mice will breed and pass on the new mutated gene to their offspring, and then this is repeated over many generations. And that would give you the majority of the marks for this question. But it's important that when you answer GCSE questions, you account for all parts of the question. And this one wants you to make some reference to the idea of genetic analysis. We call it genetic profiling, and it's the idea that DNA from ancient remains can be compared to the mice from today, and we can identify differences between them, including this new mutated gene. Okay, so it's really important that you account for all parts of the question. Okay, when you come back to maybe look at this PowerPoint again, I'm going to finish off now with a little plenary practice, but there are lots of examples for you to practice on your own. Okay, so the time is nearly up. I've got 3 minutes left, so we're going to finish with a little plenary task. I'm going to explain what next week is, and then after this session is finished, you are free then to use the resources when they're available on the website to go through the rest of the examples then in your own time. Okay, so here are your keywords that we went through today. So we've got mutation, phenotype, natural selection, evolution, variation, and gene. Okay, so these are our keywords that we looked at today. I mentioned in session 1 that you may not be asked to define these words, but it's really important that you understand what they mean. So let's see if we can spot the definition. So which one of those is a mutation? Which one of these definitions is a mutation? You should have come up with a random and spontaneous change in the structure of a gene, chromosome, or number of chromosomes. What about phenotype? Which one is phenotype? Okay, so you should have said the bottom one, the visible characteristics of an organism which occur as the result of its genes. What about natural selection? Which of those kinds of summarize what I've been talking about natural selection? Okay, so that one, the natural process whereby the best adapted individuals survive longer, have more offspring, and thereby spread their characteristics, or pass on their characteristics, I think is nicer. Variation, oh sorry, where were we? Evolution. The change of inherited characteristics within a population over time through natural selection. Variation is the differences between individuals of the same species. And then a gene is a section of DNA which controls protein production. Okay, so all of these are keywords that you need to know for this part of the GCSE. Okay, so again, use this PowerPoint at a later date when you lead up to your assessments then and practice these keywords. Even if you're not asked to define them, it's really important that you understand the meaning of these keywords because they'll be within a question. Okay, right, well, that's it from me. Next week is our last session, unfortunately. So next week, Tuesday, oh, I put Tuesday the 16th, that's today. It's next Tuesday, I mean. The session that we're going to be doing is on glucose regulation. So it's in the response and regulation section of the biology topic. And I'll make sure that you get access to the resources as soon as the session is over. Okay, thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope to see you next week. Okay, thank you everyone. Bye bye.